Ethiopia's current unrest has its origin in December of 2015, when university students joined other locals in the Oromia region in protesting against plans to expand the municipal boundaries of the capital city, Addis Ababa. To the Ethiopian government, this expansion was part of its urban development plans, but to many ethnic Oromos, it represented a land grab, not just against local farmers and landowners, but also against the Oromia region and the Oromo peoples as a whole. Now, this so-called Addis Master Plan was cancelled in January of 2016, but the protests continued and took on wider grievances, including claims that the Ethiopian government is dominated by ethnic Tigrayans through their TPLF wing of the ruling coalition at the expense of ethnic Oromos. These protests quickly came to include vandalism and arson attacks, directed not just against assets of the government, but also against foreign-owned commercial investment and other projects, including flower farms and factories. Now, many of these projects are blamed by locals for the land expropriation, which the government has to do to make way for this investment in the first place, but also for generally supporting the government through revenue in a wider sense. Protests also broke out in Ethiopia's Amhara region in July of 2016, when the government and security forces attempted to arrest a number of Amhara activist leaders, who the government accuses of being terrorists, but who themselves claim that historically Amhara land had been annexed by the Tigray region. Now, a greater prevalence of firearms ownership in the Amhara region, as compared to Oromia, meant that once these protests broke out, we saw a greater number of gun battles with security forces taking place around them. These protests came to be characterized by similar claims of Tigrayan domination of Ethiopia and of land being stolen. And there was also a strong element of ethnic consciousness in these protests. This has a long history amongst the Oromo, but is a much newer development amongst the Amhara. And these protests also similarly came to include arson and vandalism attacks being directed against foreign-owned commercial investments and government assets in the Amhara region. Now, both the Oromo and Amhara protests also, however, included limited violent attacks against the property and persons of ethnic Tigrayans in both the Oromo and the Amhara regions. These protests, both of them, the Oromo and the Amhara protests, were driven as well by a heavy-handed security forces response, which inflicted many protester fatalities, indeed including at least 600 deaths. Facing widespread protests amongst both the Amhara and the Oromo, who cumulatively make up around 60% of Ethiopia's population, in October of 2016, the Ethiopian government declared a nationwide state of emergency, accompanied by curfews and tens of thousands of arrests. The mass arrests and heightened security around key investment sites that came with Ethiopia's state of emergency quickly decreased the prevalence of protests and demonstrations nationwide. Government responses to the protests which they announced included attempts to tackle corruption, youth unemployment, and bad governance, rather than the protesters' stated political grievances which they themselves voiced. While the government renewed the state of emergency in March of 2017, it was subsequently ended in August of last year. Since then, protests have gradually resumed, this time citing similar grievances, but also being driven by other new events that are pushing new surges in protester activity. Notably, violent incidents involving the Liu police of Ethiopia's Somali region and Oromo civilians, and retaliatory incidents involving both Oromo and Somali civilians and militias have come to be a grievance that is cited by protests throughout the whole of Oromia, not just in the areas being directly impacted by the violence. Now, because the heightened security around key investment sites we saw come in during the state of emergency has continued even after its end, this has meant that violent protests have shifted their attention away from vandalism and arson directed against property and more towards targeting road vehicles and cargo that's moving throughout the country. And this involves vehicles being stopped at the side of the road and burned, even along major highways. Protests in Ethiopia during 2018 are very likely to continue, as the grievances that drive them, as voiced by the protesters themselves, continue to remain largely unaddressed. Vested interests within the government mean that it would be very difficult to enact sufficient political reform to satisfy popular discontent within the Oromia and Amhara regions. And the government's ambitious development plans make it very difficult again for the government to limit the impact of land expropriation upon these populations. Even the satisfaction of elite-level Oromo and Amhara politicians, for example by commercial concessions from the government, would really struggle to dampen protests overall, as many of the participants in the demonstrations already believe these leaders have sold them out to the government. Protests during 2018 are likely to continue in their previous pattern of cycles of surges of protester activity and periods of comparative quiet, and for this to be driven by particular events and grievances that emerge, as we saw with the Oromo-Somali violence during the latter half of 2017. These protests are likely to continue to include low-level violence, arson and vandalism directed against the property and persons associated with the government, with ethnic Tigrayans, and with foreign-owned commercial projects and vehicles in the Oromia and Amhara regions. Now, despite professions of solidarity at demonstrations and very occasional joint protests inside Ethiopia itself, the overall level of cooperation between the Oromo and Amhara protest movement is likely to remain very low. The Shua region in central Ethiopia, which is shared between the Amhara and Oromia regions, is the most likely area where we would see Oromo and Amhara coming together for joint protests. But overall, these two movements remain highly divided and mutually suspicious of each other, for example, over their differing visions for the future and status of the city of Addis Ababa. And none of this is to ignore the potential for unrest to break out elsewhere in Ethiopia with its own driving factors. For example, over ethnic minority recognition in the southern nation's nationalities and peoples region, over refugee influxes in the Gambella, or even over changes at the elite level of TPLF politics in the Tigray region, though these latter protests are much less likely to be violent. In terms of the capital city, Addis Ababa itself, this is a less likely site for mass protests due to the extensive government surveillance and security presence within the city. Really, for protests to be seen in Addis Ababa itself, we would have to be seeing mass unrest sweeping over the rest of the country as a whole. A document that purports to be a leaked Ethiopian National Security Council report from October of last year presents the current unrest in the country not just as a law and order problem, but as a threat to the integrity of Ethiopia's ethnic federal system as a whole. It also expresses worries about a new, unidentified terrorist group that it alleges is taking part in the Oromo-Somali violence, and concerns about increased weapons proliferation and availability throughout the country. Now, one factor that has always helped to limit Oromo militancy in Ethiopia has been the limited availability of firearms in central Oromia as compared to the region's western and eastern fringes. If firearms really are becoming more available in central Oromia, this moves us one step closer to a situation where we'd start to see attacks on road cargo and on isolated government assets and security forces that start to utilize firearms as well as just arson and vandalism. This dynamic involving firearms is something that we already see across parts of the Amhara region. Now, if we see sustained unrest in the towns and cities, it's likely that an increase in rural insecurity will soon follow. Keeping a lid on all this will be Ethiopia's security forces, who, despite limited instances and reports of desertions, remain fundamentally loyal to the government. And what this means is that an increase in rural insecurity can't really threaten the stability of Ethiopia's government, nor really could anything short of a near universal civil uprising in the towns and cities. One difficult issue for the government, however, when it comes to the security forces, will be the Liu police of the Somali region, who on the one hand have clearly become an aggravating factor of unrest in Oromia, but who on the other hand, the Ethiopian government needs to keep occupied and involved in a mission in order to keep them relevant and to justify their existence. This is going to be yet another issue which the Ethiopian government is going to have to navigate very carefully. Any real indications or signs of cracks in the military's loyalty bodes very poorly indeed for the stability of the Ethiopian government and its system as we know it.